The hijackers were instruments of evil who died in vain. Behind them is a cult of evil which seeks to harm the innocent and thrives on human suffering. Theirs is the worst kind of cruelty. The cruelty that is fed, not weakened, by tears. Theirs is the worst kind of violence. Pure malice while daring to claim the authority of God. We cannot fully understand the designs and power of evil. It is enough to know that evil, like goodness, exists. And in the terrorist, evil has found a willing servant.
We got two isolated pockets of fire. We should be able to knock it down with 2 lines. Ready on that. 78th floor, numerous 1045 call horns. I got an eyewitness who said there was an explosion on floor 7-8. 7-8. We've just had another explosion. Warren Street because of the secondary explosion. We've got numerous people covered with dust from the secondary explosion. And we got another explosion on the tower, 1013. 1013 down 2 has had a major explosion and what appears to be a complete collapse surrounding the entire area. Who's involved in the secondary explosion at Tower Tower?
Oh my God, thank you, thank you, thank you. Oh my God. Oh my God. Look at the shadow of death. Oh my God. You're right. Oh my God, you saved my life. You saved my life, thank you.
Tell us, what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Jesus answered and said, the first thing he says, take heed that no one deceives you. In other words, this end is going to be full of deception, and we've got to see clearly.
My name is Ellen Mariani. My husband and I lived in Derry, New Hampshire. The love of my life. We decided to remodel the house, and all of a sudden I was informed my youngest daughter was getting married. So we planned around that to take a trip, and he didn't think he should go financially. I wanted him to go to my daughter's wedding. It was his stepdaughter, and he'd help bring her up. So I held 3 or 4 yard sales, or they call them yard sales, garage sales, whatever back there. Got enough money, he purchased a ticket. We got up real early, 3:30 in the morning, and we had a lovely meal and coffee and talked, and we was happy, and got into Logan Airport in Boston. Actually, we saw the sunrise together. I came, to change planes in Chicago, and I was informed his plane had crashed. There will be a day that they will see and hear my story, and my story is just bits and pieces what I'm telling you today, has nothing to do with politics, has nothing to do with religion. It's being true person to other people, a Christian. Do good to others. You don't kick them when they're down. And that's what they've done to me. They've been very cruel, the judicial system. They don't want the truth out. They've done everything you can think of. In the courts, because I was the first lawsuit, they threw that out, called it security, national security.
My name is Michael Woolsey, and I live in Colorado, co-founder of the Colorado 9/11 Visibility Project. I'm also the host of the Visibility 9/11 podcast, which is the podcast dedicated to exposing the fraud of the official story. And we started the Colorado 9/11 Visibility Project as an effort to educate people about the events of September 11th that most people in America, and indeed the world, did not know about.
False flag operations are shocking, often destructive, arranged events that are attributed to somebody other than the party that actually was responsible for them.
Where a government will actually commit a self-inflicted wound against itself in order to blame its enemies.
The term false flag comes from naval warfare, in which vessels would sometimes fly a flag that was not their true flag in order to implicate some other party. They provide excuses for war. They trigger political changes or policy changes. They're often used to demonize a popular movement and bring on repression against popular movements. And many times they get used for all of these purposes at once.
There are numerous historical precedents for false flag terrorism. And, throughout history, not only our own history, but world history. President Eisenhower, when he gave his farewell address in 1961, warned the American public against the dangers of what he called the military-industrial complex.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist.
1 year later, and ironically just 1 year after Eisenhower gave his farewell address, the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the Pentagon, which is the nation's highest military officers, they had crafted a plan which has become known as the Northwoods Plan, or Operation Northwoods. And in this plan, which was signed and approved all the way up through the Joint Chiefs of Staff and signed by L.L. Lemnitzer, they called for committing false flag terrorist attacks in order to blame on Cuba, and then use that as justification for a war against them. And in fact, the title, the subject heading of the document reads, Justification for Military Intervention in Cuba. And they go through and they list elaborate plans. One of them involves chartering an aircraft with people boarded under carefully prepared aliases, like a sports team of young adults going to some event. They charted their plan to go over Cuba, and then at some point a drone was substituted, and then the drone would be flown over Cuban airspace. A Mayday signal would be transmitted, and then the aircraft was to be detonated by remote control and then blamed on Cuba. They had other plans of attacking people in Miami and Washington, D.C. They had Remember the Maine incident, that was their words, not mine, where they would actually blow up a ship in Havana Harbor, somewhere there in Cuba, blame it on Cuba, and then use that as the justification for war. And they even admitted in the document that they were trying to manipulate the public. I mean, they made the statement, casualty lists in U.S. newspapers would cause a helpful wave of national indignation. This plan was given to the President Kennedy at the time. It was declined by the President. However, President Kennedy was killed shortly after that.
There is compelling evidence and even prima facie evidence in the 911 gathering evidence about that day, September 11th, that this was a setup. This was an inside job.
Well, I think the evidence is overwhelming that it was an inside job on several counts. I could, cite evidence about the behavior of the president and his Secret Service at the school in Florida, indicating that they had to have had foreknowledge that the president wasn't a target. Likewise, for some reason, the president didn't assume his constitutional role as commander-in-chief.
So no, we do experiments in science. And that's what I've done with respect to 9/11 as much as I can. We have quite a bit of data. We have actually some of this dust, and we have analyzed the dust. There's a lot in there we could talk about as we go along that points to an inside job.
Whether or not the Pentagon was hit by Flight 77, the evidence suggests it must have been an inside job.
The official story itself is actually a greater crime than the crimes of 9/11. Many more people have been killed. More Americans have been killed. Our freedoms have been compromised. Our Constitution has been compromised. Our economy has been compromised. We're endorsing torture. Our values are lost.
I believe 9/11 was an inside job for many reasons. I start to look at the Patriot Act. I realized that the Patriot Act was ready to go on 9/11, a massive document that could not have been produced within a couple of days, which is what happened when 9/11 happened. Almost immediately we got the Patriot Act, and by October 16th it was signed into law.
I've been involved with 9/11 actually since 1993. That's when the first World Trade Center bombing happened in February 26, 1993. Primarily because when I did research on it and I followed the story on that, you come to find out that all the World Trade Center bombings in 1993 had been on the CIA payroll in Afghanistan. And so I was very suspicious of that bombing and the fact that it was more or less probably staged by government agencies in our own government, namely the most prominent on there would be the FBI.
On February 23, 1993, a bomb went off beneath the two towers of the World Trade Center. The bomb was in a truck on a timed device in level B2 of the garage. The explosion went 7 stories up, killing 6 people and injuring more than 1,000. According to the 9/11 Commission report, Yamzi Youssef, a Sunni extremist, planted the bomb. Youssef fled to Pakistan immediately after the bombing. Ralph Blumenthal of the New York Times reported another story on October 28, 1993.
It was supposedly supposed to be a sting operation where they had an FBI informant find a group of people that were allegedly going to do something harmful in the to the United States, organize them, and do a sting operation on them to arrest them. However, that didn't happen. The bomb did go off in the basement of the World Trade Center, and they did arrest these individuals by FBI agents that actually did their job, the field agents, and come to find out that all of them had been on the CIA payroll in Afghanistan.
Contrary to the 9/11 Commission report, apparently Imad Salem, a 43-year-old former Egyptian army officer, was used by the United States government to penetrate a circle of Muslim extremists. Mr. Salem secretly recorded hours of his conversations with the law enforcement officers that told him to build the bomb. Salem wanted to complain to FBI headquarters about the Bureau's failure to stop the bombing. But Agent John Aktasev persuaded him otherwise, saying, quote, "I don't think the New York people would like the things out of the New York offices to go to Washington, D.C." Agent Nancy Floyd verified Imad Salem's account. The Independent reported that several of the bombers were trained by the CIA to fight in the Afghan war, and that the CIA admitted partial responsibility for the bombings. Ron Kuby, defense attorney, said concerning the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, quote, "The mastermind of the 1993 WTC bombing is the government of the United States. It was a phony government-engineered conspiracy to begin with, and it would never have amounted to anything had the government not planned it."
I just could not fathom the idea that here we were on the east coast of the United States, probably the most heavily populated area of our country, our nation's capital, our nation's trade center there in New York, and yet over almost 2 hours, our skies were left undefended by our military, and we have the most advanced military and radar defense system in the world. And so it seemed odd that our military wasn't able to intercept, at the very least, the plane that allegedly was flown into the Pentagon.
One can imagine incompetence possibly leading to the towers being hit. But in the case of Flight 77, which supposedly hit the Pentagon at 9:35, the first hit was almost an hour before that on the first tower. So almost an hour after the first tower is hit, somebody who can't fly a Cessna takes over a jetliner, flies it from Ohio to D.C., does a stunt maneuver, and hits the Pentagon. This story is preposterous. D.C. has got air defenses. This plane flew over the Capitol and the White House. These are restricted zones with automatic anti-aircraft batteries. The Pentagon is probably the world's best defended building, so the notion that they could just waltz into the Pentagon like that an hour after the first tower, almost an hour after the tower was hit, it's ridiculous, completely ridiculous.
NORAD, Northern Command, and North American Aerospace Defense Command are supposed to respond immediately when an aircraft loses communications. But this was not the case on September 11th, 2001. NORAD blames the FAA, and the FAA blames NORAD for the failure of communication. In an instruction to the Chairman Joint Chiefs of Staff, dated June 1st, 2001, and signed by Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, commanders in the field were stripped of all authority to act by superseding earlier Department of Defense procedures for dealing with hijacked aircraft. In 2000, fighters were launched 129 times in response to aircraft flight problems. In each occurrence, the problem was immediately resolved. Under general circumstances, NORAD is prepared to scramble fighters within 15 minutes of being notified. Because of the military exercises taking place on September 11, 2001, fighters were capable of being launched in only 6 to 8 minutes and could reach their targets within another 6 to 10 minutes. However, on 9/11, they were unable to intercept even the last hijacked plane, Flight 93, 1 hour and 45 minutes after our government knew that the first plane, Flight 11, had been hijacked. It is possible that NORAD and the FAA were confused and didn't know the difference between a real-world emergency and a simulated drill.
We do know for a fact that there were at least 4 military drills going on the morning of September 11, 2001, which some of them attempted to drill participants in the very scenario which was happening that morning, which sounds unbelievable, but it's true. It's documented. So as things began to unfold, I think that these drills served as a distraction and a mechanism to confuse those who were actually in charge of protecting our skies.
In what our government likes to call a bizarre coincidence, on the morning of September 11th, one U.S. intelligence agency was running a pre-planned drill focused on planes crashing into buildings. Yet tragically, the attack was real. That morning, NORAD was 3 days into Operation Vigilant Guardian, which was designed to boost NORAD's continent-spanning surveillance, communication, and interception. So in fact, when NORAD staff was already on high alert because of Vigilant Guardian and Northern Vigilance, both emergency exercises, the transponder signal from Flight 93 stopped, at 9:40 a.m.
The first story that pertained during the first week was that no fighter jets had been launched during the run-up to these attacks. Then the second story that came out a week later was that indeed jets had been launched, but they were launched from the wrong bases, rather than, say, from Andrews Air Force Base, which was charged with protecting Washington, D.C. They were launched from Langley, which is 100-some miles away, and likewise with New York. But the problem here was that these planes just got there a hair too late. They got there a hair too late to protect the World Trade Center and a hair too late to protect the Pentagon. Well, the problem is if you do the math, you find that these jets would have had to have been flying too slow. If you just do the straight math on the distance and so on, they were flying at, they would have to go under 300 miles an hour to get there late, and their top speed is 1,800 miles an hour. If you factor in the taking off and so on, it's not quite that bad, but it's still pretty bad. It's still an absurd story. The people who made up that story realized how absurd it was, because when the 9/11 Commission was investigating this, they actually first heard this story that the fighter jets launched but got there late, and they were told that under oath by NORAD people. And then NORAD changed its story during the course of the 9/11 Commission investigation and produced a third, radically different story, a story that's totally chaotic, that if true would mean that dozens of FAA officials and NORAD officials should be charged with criminal negligence.
At 10:01 a.m., nearly an hour after Flight 93 had been hijacked, and 10 minutes after the first plane crashed, the FAA ordered F-16s to scramble from Toledo, Ohio. 16 minutes later, fighters were in the air, going after Delta Flight 1989, not Flight 93. Flight 1989 was not out of contact with air traffic controllers and was not being hijacked. At 10:03 a.m., the NMCC, the National Military Command Center, learned of the hijacking of Flight 93, but NORAD was still unaware of the hijacking. After the attacks on the towers and the Pentagon, Vice President Dick Cheney was rushed to a control bunker, where 3 times he gave the authority to shoot down Flight 93. Subsequently, the jet's crash landing in Pennsylvania was accredited to the passengers on board by the 9/11 Commission report. Additional evidence suggests it was shot down. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld stated during a Christmas Eve address to U.S. troops in Baghdad, quote, "The people who attacked the United States in New York shot down the plane over Pennsylvania." Later, a Pentagon spokesperson simply said Rumsfeld misspoke. Light debris was found up to 8 miles away from the crash site. Also, a section of the engine weighing 1 ton was found over a mile from the crash site. It's important to note that a heat-seeking missile hits the hottest part of a targeted aircraft, its engine. One witness to Flight 93's crash landing said, quote, "Yes, there was another plane. I didn't get a good look, but it was white, and it circled the area about twice, and then it flew off over the horizon." Tom Spinelli, working at India Lake Marina, a mile and a half away, also saw the white plane. Lee Purbaugh saw the last seconds of Flight 93 as it came down on former strip mining land at 10:06 a.m. He also reported seeing a white jet. Ernie Stoll, the mayor of Shanksville, a village near the crash site, said that F-16 fighters were very, very close, and that 2 men he knew claimed they heard a missile. Other witnesses to the second plane were Dennis Decker and Jim Brandt. Shortly after 9/11, NORAD claimed that there was a fighter 100 miles away from Flight 93 when it crashed, but no further details were given. CBS reported that F-16 fighters were within 60 miles of Flight 93 when it crashed. However, fighters were not diverted from Michigan until after Flight 93 crashed. Susan McElwain, among others, states she saw a low-flying white jet at the Flight 93 crash. According to the Washington Post, because of Vice President Cheney's order, President Bush asked regarding Flight 93, "Did we shoot it down or did it crash?" Hours later, Bush was assured that it crashed.
You see, when you buy a ticket, you buy it for a safe destination. And he didn't get to his destination. I wanted a trial by jury. I want the truth. We can then heal. And it's not only for me. It's for the younger people, their future, and grandchildren and everybody else. That's the only way we'll ever heal. You must tell us what happened.
We've just had another explosion. I got an eyewitness who said there was an explosion on floor 7 to 8. And we got another explosion on the tower, 1013. 1013, tower 2 has had a major explosion and what appears to be a complete collapse.
We made it at least 2 blocks, and we started running. Floor by floor, it started popping out.
It was if they had detonated.
Detonated.
They were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
As we were getting our gear on and making our way to the stairway, there was a heavy-duty explosion.
Some of the people out, then there was secondary explosions, and then the subsequent collapses.
Well, me and Mr. Hess, the Corporation Counsel, were on the 23rd floor. I told him we got to get out of here. We started walking down the stairs. We made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion.
To me, it sounded like an explosion, then the building, the rolling sound sounded like the building collapsed.
I was making my way to the foot of the World Trade Center. Suddenly, while talking to an officer who was questioning me about my press credentials, we heard a very loud blast, an explosion. We looked up, and the building literally began to collapse.
Like, it sounded like gunfire. You know, bang, 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 bang. And then all of a sudden, 3 big explosions.
You have 2 110-story office buildings. You don't find a desk. You don't find a chair. You don't find a telephone, a computer. The biggest piece of a telephone I found was half of the keypad, and it was about this big. The building collapsed to dust.
What is the story behind World Trade Center Building 7, the nearby 47-story building? Although it wasn't hit by any planes or debris, it was demolished shortly after 5:20 p.m. on September 11th. CNN reported the building on fire at 4:10 p.m. The Kansas City Star reported that at 4:30 p.m. the area was evacuated, and less than 1 hour later, it collapsed.
Building 7 was what I would call a smoking gun when it comes to September 11th.
Anybody who's watched Building 7 come down into its own footprint at free fall speed, and then who's watched the owner, Larry Silverstein, who made billions of dollars on a 6-week investment, apparently confess to pulling it or demolishing it. Anyone who's seen just these 2 clips, I think, knows that there's a huge problem with the official story of 9/11.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, you know, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
Why was the sprinkler system in WTC 7 not activated? Why did this 47-story building collapse?
Since then, Larry Silverstein, after a long period of ignoring it, finally had no choice and had to come out and say, well, what I meant was that we were going to pull the firefighters.
To pull the word "it," the pronoun, appears to be the same, referring to the same noun, which would not be a firefighter brigade. And we know that there weren't any firefighters in there anyway.
They were keeping people out. They evacuated the building.
There are photos available, which we've looked at, and those show some damage on the south side. I've looked at the FEMA reports on this and the preliminary NIST report. FEMA says very clearly that the damage, as far as they can see, was not sufficiently extensive to cause collapse. I mean, after all, the damage came from the collapse of the towers. It was 7 hours later that Building 7 collapsed, so obviously the damage was not sufficient to bring the building down, otherwise it would have just come down immediately. But this is the FEMA report, says our best hypothesis, which is fire plus damage, has only a low probability of occurrence. Quite an admission. Then they say further study is needed here. If it was the south side that somehow NIST and FEMA got it wrong, you know, and somehow these columns were actually severed inside, then with the damage on the south side, you would then expect from the way statics works that the building would topple towards the south. You see, knock out the south side, but it doesn't. It comes really straight down and also very rapidly. So building 7 is very clearly, when you look at the data, something funny is going on there, and the delay in the NIST report. This really does look like controlled demolition.
Rightly so, I think there should be attention paid to that, but I think more attention should be paid to Silverstein and the fact that he had just purchased a lease on the World Trade Center tower complex.
Silverstein filed a record insurance policy just months before the attacks. The contracts had not even been formally written.
It wasn't a lot of money compared to the payoff that he got through the insurance claims, and they attempted to file it as 2 separate attacks, because one on each tower, which would double his investment, if you will, because he made a lot of money off of the collapse of those buildings, Larry Silverstein. And I think that's probably more of a focus than his poet comments.
Building 7 contained the offices of the IRS, Secret Service, Mayor Giuliani's Office of Emergency Management, the Department of Defense, and the CIA. Concerning the tower's collapse, FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, said, quote, "Layers of slabs pancake on top of each other during a collapse." National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, also investigated the World Trade Center collapse.
Let me say about the NIST report, my paper and Kevin Ryan's paper addressed the NIST report, and those 2 papers are available at journalof911studies.com. NIST commissioned Underwriters Laboratories to do an actual experiment test with fire on floor assemblies. These are model floor assemblies now, built just like the World Trade Center floor assemblies. This is the right thing to do. Do an experiment. Underwriters Laboratories built the floor assemblies, put fire in there, more intense actually than what you would expect in the towers. They beefed up those fires. NIST, to their credit, says, yeah, that's right, the steel does not melt in these towers, but maybe warps enough. So we're looking at the warping here, you see. And of course, in these experiments, where they had these extra hot fires for a long time, the steel did not melt, you see, at all. But what you do have is warping. So you've got these long floor assemblies, and the warping in the middle was about 3 inches, not that much, okay, 3 inches warping. But they didn't fail, see? They warped, yeah, 3 inches, but no failure. Kevin Ryan, he was working at Underwriters Laboratories at the time.
My name is Kevin Ryan, and currently technical services engineer for a healthcare company. I live in Indiana, and I was previously the division manager for Environmental Health Laboratories, a division of Underwriters Laboratories, also in Indiana. I have a degree in chemistry from Indiana University, and I have a certification in quality engineering, which is very closely related to standards in the National Institute of Standards and Technology. I was a laboratory manager at UL for years, so I know about testing samples to national standards. Primarily my involvement, though, is being given information both verbally and in writing about UL's involvement. Also seeing the importance of the issue, and then putting those 2 things into questions back to my upper management and what we were doing as a company to respond to the official story. But I think to some extent I was fooled by the official story as much as anyone, and I had to admit to myself at one point that I was wrong. That was in 2003. 2 years before that, right after 9/11, is when the chief executive officer of my company, Underwriters Laboratories, had told the staff that UL had tested the steel, had actually certified the steel, he said, used to build the World Trade Center towers. And found out that the steel evidence had been destroyed from the buildings. That related quite directly to the statements made by our chief executive officer that we had tested steel for fire resistance. And yet the steel had been destroyed, which the evidence would have told us what had actually happened. I first sent a formal question to our Chief Executive Officer at Underwriters Laboratories in 2003, in late 2003. And I laid these concerns out to him. I said, look, you told us that we tested the steel or certified the steel. This steel has been destroyed. There's alternative explanations for what happened. You know, the official explanation is something that is, if true, extremely low in probability. So what are we doing? What are you doing to protect our reputation as a company? And he responded a month later. He did confirm that UL had tested the steel used in the World Trade Center buildings with quite a number of statements that I have in writing. Clearly, this chief executive officer, who was a Harvard-trained lawyer, by the way, not an engineer, had fully accepted the official story and had been given information himself about testing done 40 years ago by our company to certify the steel in the World Trade Center buildings. And he shared that both verbally and in writing with staff at UL. When he wrote to me, he copied several top executives who all have this in writing right now. But he asked me to be patient, wait for the report from NIST, because UL was working closely with them to try and figure out what happened, and eventually there would be an explanation. And I did wait for another year, and the report came out. It included a great deal of contradictory information. They had done physical tests, both at UL and at NIST, that showed that the steel could not have softened, the floors could not have collapsed. And yet the report was coming out suggesting these things actually did happen. So after a period of about a year, I made a presentation in Chicago where I spelled out the problems with this latest story, official story of collapse, because really the NIST report is one of a string of stories that have been given. Kind of a media story was given, Towering Inferno. A FEMA report was given. It was a pancake story. The Silverstein insurance claim was another story. NIST now has had a couple of stories, but this final story is summarized kind of in 7 steps. And if you walk through those and fairly summarize them and look at known facts about the buildings, look at the report within itself to see if it's self-consistent, just look at the story and see if it's realistic. In all 3 cases, you can see that it's not, that it's actually false at every one of those 7 steps. And that's just a collapse initiation sequence. They don't really describe the actual dynamics of the buildings falling. They actually just say, global collapse ensued. And that way they can ignore a whole lot of evidence that points to an alternative hypothesis, like explosions from witnessing explosions or hearing it, demolition squibs coming off the buildings, the speed of collapse, which is a very important piece of evidence. They can ignore all of that by just saying global collapse ensues, period. The biggest problems with that story are the fireproofing being lost, and I show in my lecture that the tests that were done, very weak and humble tests done by NIST, proved that actually the fireproofing could not have been lost in the buildings. There was no energy for it. There was no mechanism for it to occur. That's probably the biggest problem, is the idea that the external columns would bow inward, which is primary to the official story. There is absolutely no physical testing to support that. There is no intuitive reasoning behind it.
Furthermore, in their NIST report, as you read carefully, they only take you to the point where the towers are poised, each tower is poised to collapse. That's their term, poised to collapse. They don't look at what happens after it starts moving. So now then, what does NIST do? They go to a computer simulation, which is not as good as an experiment, you got to admit, right? Because this is now a computer model trying to get an explanation for the buildings to fail. When they got to the warping, instead of 3 inches, which is what the experiment showed, 42 inches, that's over 3 feet of warping. Now, that's a big difference. So you do the experiment, you get 3 inches, like that, and you do your computer model, and you stick in there 42 inches. I mean, what? You see what I'm saying?
And the only support is from a highly manipulated computer model in which, the temperatures were exaggerated, the fire times were exaggerated, all the fireproofing was stripped off, and the floors were disconnected, so that we've got absolutely no actual conceptual framework in which to see columns being pulled inwards. But if the floors are disconnected, there's no force to pull the columns inward. How did it happen? We're talking about a phantom force now in a highly manipulated computer model. And that's what we're basing our future on, and all of these changes we're seeing. So they had test results that disproved what they were saying that happened. There were also comments being made still about jet fuel fires and melting steel by experts supporting the initial story. So I wrote to NIST, and I asked them about their report, and I asked them to please clarify the ideas that are being stated in the media and in the report. And I was fired for writing the letter. I was fired for nothing else but writing this letter. I didn't violate any policies. I had been promoted just earlier that year to the top management position in my division. They gave me a letter of termination. They said that the relationship with NISD was harmed, that it was poor judgment. I was in the front page of my local newspaper, who also interviewed UL. And they asked UL, well, is this guy, what this guy's saying true? Did you test or certify the steel? And they said, well, there's no evidence that we tested the steel. They didn't say they didn't do it or their CEO was wrong. They said there was no evidence for it. Okay, that's a problem.
NIST is also under non-disclosure agreement. That's in their report. In other words, they can't say too much. So someone above them is putting these constraints on these guys. We offered to sit down with the guys at NIST or debate them, sit down, whatever, talk to them about our concerns. They declined. We had mentioned a specific time and place. And so we said, well, look, you name the time and place. We just think we ought to talk about these problems. I mean, this affects the whole world, really. The weaknesses in your analysis. And I guess I wasn't too surprised. They said a change in venue and a change in time will not change our decision. We're not going to sit down and talk.
I'm Jim Nesh. I've been in the foundry business for approximately 28 years. My expertise is I pour metal. I have a gas-fired furnace. It runs 750,000 BTUs, and I pour all non-ferrous metals, brass, bronze, aluminum. It takes me approximately, in a controlled environment inside the furnace, 45 to 55 minutes to melt brass, which is poured at 1950 to 2000 degrees. Bronze is higher temperature, but I can go to like 2350. I do not pour steel because it's too hot. Crematories are above, like say 2500 degrees, that people are disintegrated. That if there were people in that building, how did they peek out and look or jump? How are they not melted immediately if they have a heat that intense to warp or mess with the structure of steel? How are the people still alive? It's impossible. To weaken something 50 feet away would have melted you to be in its vicinity. Logically, physically, no way could have caused a collapse in any way. It could not have affected the collapse of the World Trade Center. It's impossible.
After you let the buildings come down, you have to explain this flowing material right at the corner, by the way, which is on the north face of the South Tower. But right there at that corner, this molten metal with the orange glow, yellow-orange glow, flows out for minutes. There's a lot of it. And then right at that corner, you see this weakening, the twisting and the collapse of the building. NIST tries to explain that molten metal, which is yellow-orange color, a lot of material flowing out. They said, well, it's aluminum. That's what they said early on. And then I did experiments with aluminum and it's silvery. So they came back and said, well, aluminum with, wood, chips, plastic, carpet, stuff mixed in, but that, they said, can have an orange glow. Well, the can caught my attention. I immediately was out doing experiments, Molten aluminum, we put in some wood chips and plastic, wood ash from my wood-burning stove, and carpet pieces and glass. I mean, we're just putting all this stuff in there, melt this stuff up, and we have a young professor here who came from NIST. He couldn't believe that NIST would say, you know, if you mix organics with aluminum and pour it out, now it'll have an orange glow. He couldn't believe they'd be wrong, but we couldn't get it. So he was working with me for over an hour, mixing this concoction of molten aluminum with wood, glass, plastic, carpet pieces, mix, and you know, it doesn't want to mix, that is, the organics don't want to mix with the molten aluminum. We just poured it out. He poured it out, actually. Silvery, not orange glow, no orange glow.
I melt aluminum. Aluminum is white colored, silver colored. There is no different colors in it. That's the only color it can be because it's silver colored. To have a different color in there means another chemical has to be involved. There was no melting of any structures below whatever story it was on down. So if something fell, it's going to just land there and stay there. The building's not going to fall down.
On July 28, 1945, the Empire State Building was struck by a bomber on its way to Newark Airport. It left a hole 18 feet wide and 20 feet high, but the building did not collapse. It was for this reason that the World Trade Towers were built to sustain impacts from several jet airliners.
The building was designed to have a fully loaded 707 crash into it. That was the largest plane at the time. I believe that the building probably could sustain multiple impacts of jetliners because this structure is like the mosquito netting on your screen door, this intense grid, and the jet plane is just a pencil puncturing that screen netting. It really does nothing to the screen netting.
Frank A. DiMartini died in the 9/11 attacks. Lee Robertson, the WTC project structural engineer, also confirmed that the towers were designed to take hits from jet aircraft.
Well, the columns and core this was a self-standing core. It was the first thing that went up and the rest of the building was built around it. 47, these are huge columns, 47 of them, and they held the elevator shafts and some service floors and so forth. This was regular construction grade steel, A36 it's called, which means it has 36,000 psi of yield strength or greater. And so it's typical construction steel, but it's very huge columns. Around the outside of the building were 236 columns that were box columns made of very high grade steel, like 65,000 psi steel.
Let's take a look now then at these 14 floors above the damage where the plane came in as a block in the North Tower. And let's do two things. Let's have a giant crane and imagine that picks up 14 floors and just drops them in air. You know, no building below, just drop them in air. How long will it take for the roof to get to the ground when you do that? Well, it works out to just about 9 or 10 seconds. There's some air resistance, but pretty much ignore that. The height of the North Tower, 1,368 feet. If you dropped a steel ball in vacuum, it would drop in 9.2 seconds. So we got this big block. We're doing the same thing, except we're dropping it in air. And, 9 or 10 seconds is what you'd expect. Now, how long did it actually take the building to collapse? Well, it's about 10 seconds, maybe 12. It's a little hard to tell now because there's so much dust. But if you look at the seismic record, when the shaking started, as that building started coming down, and when it ends, just about 10 seconds. Okay, now we've done that one experiment. We drop it in air, 10 seconds. Now you take the same block and you drop it over the rest of the tower that's still there. You've got 47 core columns below, 240, these are steel columns going up the center of that thing, huge. At the base they're 4 foot by 2 foot, steel, okay. Interconnected columns, designed to stay standing, not to just give up, when something hits them. And then you've got 240 perimeter columns. Now you drop that block of 14 stories, okay, above the damage zone. You let that drop on the rest of the building. What happens? Well, which is going to take longer? The one you drop in air or the one you drop on, a couple 100,000 tons of steel and concrete that's designed to remain standing? Which is going to take longer? The one that you drop on the building obviously should take a lot longer than the one you just drop in air. The situation, when you time it, it's essentially free fall speed. Goodness, how does that happen with all this steel in the way? This is another way of saying that we need to look at conservation of energy and momentum. That analysis has been done by Professor Cutler, professor of mathematics. He comes up with 36 to 40 seconds, just this block hitting stationary matter. And now you throw in the columns, and this gets us to Gordon Ross, a mechanical engineer in the United Kingdom. He says you put in the columns and conservation of energy and conservation of momentum. None of those looked at by FEMA and NIST, you see this. His final result is that the upper block will stop. The destruction goes a ways, but then it stops. I mean, why should we assume that the building below just gives up? No. That upper block goes a ways and then it stops. And it might actually fall off due to asymmetry. That's what you expect. You don't expect it to fall straight down at near free fall speed unless you get the material out of the way below. The way that's done is with explosives. That gets us to thermite. And there's a lot of evidence for the use of thermite, and super thermites are is the form of thermite which is explosive. I actually have here in my lab some aluminum powder and iron oxide powder, and those are the basic components for thermite. So we took our thermite mixture and we actually put a propane torch right directly on the thermite, so to simulate effects from fires and the plane fires, the jet fuel burning, which it burned out most of it in just a few minutes. Most people don't know that, but that's what the NIST report says. I think that's right. The plane comes, you say this huge fireball, a lot of it's gone there, and then the rest is basically the jet fuel is a kerosene type of a fuel, and it burns quite quickly. So anyway, we're hitting this thermite with propane torch to simulate these fires. It didn't catch on fire at all. This is the Scholars for 9/11 Truth now. We've been doing research, and one of the scholars, Robert Moore, found an invention in the 1990s. It's a tube, and they put thermite in this tube, and there's a groove along the edge. Actually, it's like this coming out of this tube. It's a nozzle, but a linear nozzle, and the thermite jets out of that just like a knife. This will cut through materials of substantial thickness, including, you see, steel beams that you can cut through with this device loaded with thermite. So we've done experiments here with thermite, and you notice the dust cloud. This is a white cloud that drifts away, aluminum oxide, and then there's this molten iron that pours out of the thermite reaction. Now the military form of thermite, they add sulfur to the basic thermite, and what happens there now, the sulfur attacks steel, and it forms a eutectic, so the steel will melt at a much lower temperature. So instead of 1500 centigrade, the normal melting temperature for steel, which by the way the fires wouldn't reach in the building, nowhere near that. With sulfur, you bring that melting point down to about 600 centigrade. This is now called thermate, and it'll just slice through steel like a hot knife through butter. And then there are other metal oxides you can use in thermite besides iron oxide. For instance, zinc oxide and potassium permanganate is a great oxidizer. Barium nitrate is used by the military in their patented form of thermate. There are strong evidences for the use of these thermites this chemical reaction in the dust itself. And we're not the only lab that's noticed anomalies in the dust. USGS, for instance, reported a very strong zinc component. And in this World Trade Center dust, there's all this zinc dust. There's also a lot of iron and sulfur, but those have prosaic explanations, possible. But the zinc, manganese, and barium in the dust, which we report, which independent labs report, those point to thermites, as somebody really knew what they were doing. We've tested a number of those that we see in the dust, and therefore we build our thermate that way. We put that in a steel container. Boom, it just blasted through with corrosion. And you can see it on the steel. It just cuts through very rapidly. And then there's this corrosion on the steel. Corrosion, by the way, which is observed in cars near the World Trade Center towers as they collapsed. There's this dramatic corrosion on the roofs. About 1,000 cars or so. I've seen 1,300 mentioned cars damaged in this way with this enormous, strange corrosion on the roof. So, but that's what you expect from thermite residue falling onto cars. You expect it to corrode the cars, just like it corrodes and cuts through the steel. Overwhelming, comes to mind because of the way these data just fit together, not just our lab, but other labs as well. Worcester Polytechnic Institute had steel from the rubble of World Trade Center 7 and the tower, the towers region. It was all jumbled together over there. And they found sulfidation in the steel, just what we're talking about. And they had no explanation. Thermites fit the picture, the molten material flowing out, the white wispy ash drifting away, that would be the aluminum oxide, the bright reaction region, intense, which NIST has a photo of this, they just didn't know how to explain it. Well, thermite explains that. And then subsequently the flow of molten metal, the ash, it's all explained. And then the zinc, manganese, and barium in the dust, and the sulfidation, you add a little sulfur, remember, to make that thermite cut through steel faster. So all those things are present.
On the 16th of September, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration used an airborne visible infrared imaging spectrometer, or AVIRIS, to measure hotspots, such as the east corner of the South Tower. It measured a temperature of 1,377 degrees Fahrenheit. The Giuliani administration's decision to ship off the tower's scrap to recycling yards angered the victims' families and engineers who believed that it needed to be examined further to help explain exactly how the Twin Towers came down. But New York Mayor Mike Bloomberg insisted, quote, "Just looking at a piece of metal doesn't tell you anything." The so-called full investigative team set up by FEMA was not even allowed to enter Ground Zero to collect other potentially critical evidence. This evidence would have been extremely helpful in ascertaining why 14 search and rescue dogs have died, including 8 from cancer due to exposure to toxic rubble at Ground Zero.
I think the towers had to come down from planted explosives. It looks like the only way to me. I mean, I've seen buildings come down in Denver when they do a controlled demolition. They come down exactly as they stand, straight down. The World Trade Centers fell straight down. A plane lands in it, and supposedly, the building automatically crashes from that. I just don't believe it.
One reason for concluding that the 3 buildings were brought down by explosive is the very fact that they did collapse. High-rise steel frame buildings have never, before or after 9/11, been caused to collapse by fire. Even when, as in the Philadelphia fire of 1999 and the Madrid fire of February of this year, the fires were much larger, much hotter, and much longer lasting than any of the fires in the World Trade Center. The second reason is the specific nature of the collapses, each feature of which points to explosives. For example, the buildings collapsed straight down and at virtually free fall speed, as in controlled demolitions. And then the rubble smoldered for months afterwards.
Given that there was no way that ragtag terrorists could have gotten into places like Building 7, a nerve center of the American intelligence empire, the second biggest CIA building after Langley, Virginia, and brought these buildings down with precisely timed sequences of explosives. You know, those kinds of controlled demolitions could only have been conducted by experts. And there are very few experts in the world with that kind of capability. So it certainly wasn't 19 crazy Arab kids led by a guy on dialysis in a cave in Afghanistan. So by inside job, what I mean, of course, is that elements of the U.S. military industrial intelligence complex were involved in orchestrating the events of 9/11.
We know something's not right. Let's come forward and tell exactly. Don't take the steel and put it into another country. Don't block a widow from talking. You know, don't throw out her lawsuit. So somebody is hiding something.
In July of 2001, CBS reported, quote, in response to inquiries from CBS News over why Attorney General John Ashcroft was traveling exclusively by leased jet aircraft instead of commercial airlines, the Justice Department cited what it called a threat assessment by the FBI and said Ashcroft had been advised to travel only by private jet for the remainder of his term. Others were also forewarned, including Mayor Willie Brown, as well as the author of the Satanic Verses, Salman Rushdie. The Defense Planning Guidance Draft of 1992 was written during the administration of Bush Sr. by Paul Wolfowitz for then Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney. Later, Cheney tried to distance himself from it because of its controversy. Its central strategy was to establish and protect a new order. It mentions preemptive attacks and a plan for military intervention in Iraq as an action necessary to ensure, quote, access to vital raw material, primarily Persian Gulf oil. In September of 2000, the neoconservative think tank, PNAC, or the Project for the New American Century, wrote a document entitled Rebuilding America's Defenses. It is available at newamericancentury.org. It was created with 27 project participants.
Now, the Project for a New American Century, or PNAC, as I will refer to them often, is a group of these neoconservatives like Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Jeb Bush, Lewis Libby, William Kristol, and several others, influential people who are in our government right now, or influential positions within our media.
Some of the goals set forth in PNAC call for increased defense spending to preserve American geopolitical leadership, to exploit the revolution in military affairs, develop and deploy global missile defense, as well as to fight and win multiple, simultaneous, major theater wars. PNAC cited biological warfare as a politically useful tool. The document states, quote, advanced forms of biological warfare that can target specific genotypes may transform biological warfare from the realm of terror to a politically useful tool. It goes on to say, to preserve military preeminence in the coming decades, the Department of Defense must move more aggressively to experiment with new technologies and operational concepts and seek to exploit the emerging revolution in military affairs. This document also called for a premeditated attack on Iraq to secure regime change. PNAC's RAD also planned for a new Pearl Harbor, such as 9/11. Specifically, it states, quote, the process of transformation, even if it brings revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event, like a new Pearl Harbor.
They called for a new Pearl Harbor. And that's, again, is their words, not mine. They were basically calling for a huge, massive military buildup in America. They criticized Bill Clinton This group was formed in 1997 while Clinton was still in office. And they'd actually written a letter to President Clinton. It's on their website, newamericancentury.org. They'd written a letter to President Clinton criticizing him for cutting defense spending and just railing him for leaving us unprotected in their eyes. And they wanted to get Iraq especially. They wanted Saddam Hussein.
Another similar document was the National Security Strategy of the United States of America, or NSS 2002. The document states in Chapter 8, quote, "The events of September 11th, 2001 opened vast, new opportunities." NSS 2002 also cited preemptive strikes, as stated in George Bush's cover letter. Bush said, quote, "As a matter of common sense and self-defense, America will act against such emerging threats before they are fully formed."
They brought out the Patriot Act right after September 11th. This was a huge infringement on our freedoms as Americans. Okay? And since then we have seen a steady chain of usurpations upon our freedoms here in America. The Patriot Act was the first one that sprung forth out of 9/11. We now do not have habeas corpus in America anymore. The government is looking at our emails. They're listening to our phone calls. We have COINTELPRO operations being conducted against activists who are using their First Amendment to petition their government. So one of the main motives, I believe, is to take away our freedoms. Now, why would they want to take away our freedoms? Well, the answer is simple. It's all about globalism. One of the main obstacles, and if not the only obstacle, to the people who would bring in a one-world government is the United States. The idea here is that those who would bring the United States into a world government must take away our freedoms. Most of the world does not have the freedoms that we enjoy in America, or that we're supposed to enjoy, the God-given rights that we possess that are guaranteed to us by our founding documents. In order to merge us with the rest of the world, they've either got to give the rest of the world all the rights we've got, or they've got to take the rights away that we've got so that everything's the same.
Those who scare peace-loving people with phantoms of lost liberty, my message is this: your tactics only aid terrorists, for they erode our national unity and diminish our resolve. Charges of kangaroo courts and shredding the Constitution give new meaning to the term fog of war. Since lives and liberties depend on clarity, not obfuscation, and upon reason, not hyperbole, let me take this opportunity to be clear. My message to America this morning then is this: if you fit this definition of a terrorist, fear the United States, for you will lose your liberty.
You are with us, or you're with the terrorists. And if you're with the terrorists, you will face the consequences.
I'm a person that questions everything. It's show me, prove it to me. I watched for 3 weeks all the war that was going on, you know, what they said, everything. 3 months, I'm sorry, 3 months. And then I said, there's a lie here. They're not telling us the truth. And these are not conspiracies. This is what happened to a widow. And let me tell you, if you haven't read in the Bible what happens to a widow, if you do not help out a widow, you have a lot that's going to happen. You will be punished. You're supposed to be kind to a widow and children, and they were not. They're still not. I'm still going through hell in the courts. They don't want me to talk. I have a gag order. But everything I'm telling you today or tonight is before the gag order, and the truth is the only way it's going to set us free.
President Bush originally opposed the September 11th Commission. Then, Bush appointed Henry Kissinger, who is known for his secrecy, as head of the commission. Later, Kissinger was replaced by former New Jersey Governor Thomas Keane. The 9/11 Commission report directly follows the government's story and continues to cover up the truth. The commissioners have ties to the very parties they are investigating, like the CIA, banking, and financial interests, and Bush administration officials. For example, Philip Zelikow wrote a book with Condoleezza Rice. Zelikow was also one of the primary authors of NSS 2002. Vice Chairman Lee Hamilton said, quote, "We're not interested in trying to assess blame. We do not consider that a part of the Commission's responsibility." Dr. David Ray Griffin, author of The New Pearl Harbor and Christian Faith and the Truth Behind 9/11, mentions the revisionism and fallacies of the report in his book, The 9/11 Commission Report, Omissions and Distortions.
Most of the steel beams and columns came down in sections about 30 feet long, conveniently ready to be loaded onto trucks. These columns were the unique feature of these towers when they were first built. Well, what did the 9/11 Commission report do about that problem? It avoided the problem incredibly by simply denying the existence of these columns, even though those columns, I'm not making this up. So, the Commission report, after saying falsely that most of the weight of each tower was borne by the steel columns in its exterior walls, this supposedly authoritative report said the interior core of the buildings was a hollow steel shaft in which elevators and stairwells were grouped. Such a desperate lie is a sure sign of a cover-up. In any case, when we look at all these features of the collapses, the idea that they could have been caused by the impact of the airplanes plus the resulting fires is ridiculous. This is even clearer with regard to building number 7, which wasn't hit by any airplane, and yet it came down about 5:30 that afternoon. Its collapse remains so impossible to explain, except as controlled demolition, that the 9/11 Commission report did not even mention it, as if the collapse of a 47-story building was not worthy of comment.
The 9/11 Commission, which people think that was very thorough, in their report, they don't even mention the collapse of Building 7. In any case, we need an investigation that will give us answers about Building 7. NIST's still not given us an answer. FEMA says our best hypothesis has only a low probability of occurrence. Well, we want an investigative team that will look at the possibility of explosives.
One feature of the attacks that suggests complicity by U.S. officials is the twofold fact that the U.S. military failed to stop the attacks on 9/11, and that then, since then, they have given us 3 different stories as to why they failed. These changing stories suggest that the military has been trying to cover up the fact that a stand-down order was given on 9/11, canceling the military's own standard operating procedures for dealing with hijacked airplanes. It is certainly clear that some agency, either the military or the FAA, failed to follow standard procedures on 9/11. If you've read the story in Popular Mechanics, you know one of their big lies is, oh gee, there's only been one such interception in the last several years. No, it's a routine procedure, about 100 times a year. On 9/11, however, it did not happen. Why not? The military's first story was that no planes were sent up until after the Pentagon was hit. The military leaders were admitting, therefore, that they had left their fighters on the ground for almost 90 minutes after the FAA had first noticed signs of a possible hijacking. This first story suggested to many people that a stand-down order must have been given. By the end of the week, the military had put out a second story saying that it had sent up fighters, but that because the FAA had been very late in notifying it about the hijackings, the fighters arrived too late in each case. One problem with this story is if the FAA personnel had responded so slowly, heads should have rolled, but none did. An even more serious problem is that even assuming the truth of the late notification times, the military's fighters still had time to intercept the hijacked airliners before they were to hit their targets. The second story implied, therefore, that standard procedures had been violated by the military as well as by the FAA. To try to defend the military against this accusation, the 9/11 Commission report gave us a third story, according to which the FAA, after giving the military insufficient warning about the first hijacked airline, gave it absolutely no warning about the other three until after they had crashed. But as I have pointed out in my second book on 9/11, this account is wholly implausible. Besides portraying the FAA personnel from top to bottom as incompetent, bumbling dolts, the 9/11 Commission's account rests on claims that contradict many credible and mutually supporting testimonies. In some of these cases, the fact that the Commission is simply lying is obvious. In addition, this third story implies that the military's second story, which it had been telling for almost 3 years, was almost entirely false. So if our military leaders were lying to us all that time, why should we believe them now? And if our military is lying to us, must we not assume that it is doing so to cover up its own guilt? In sum, the behavior of the military, both on 9/11 and afterwards, combined with the fact that the 9/11 Commission had to resort to lies to make the U.S. military appear blameless, suggests that U.S. military leaders were complicit in the attacks.
I do not feel it was even correct. I feel it was lies.
It did not address reports of alleged hijackers being still alive today.
You backtrack every one of those that were on that panel. They were friends of the upper in Washington. They all had jobs or previous jobs or still have jobs connected with somebody in the government. No, that's conflict of interest.
Terry Brunner is a former federal prosecutor who now runs the Aviation Integrity Project in Chicago. Brunner checked out the commissioners and found out 6 out of 10 represent the very companies being investigated. He says they are, quote, Fred Fielding, Spirit Airlines and United Airlines. Slade Gordon represents Delta Airlines. Jim Thompson represents American Airlines. Richard Benveniste represents Boeing and United Airlines, and Representative Tom Romer, Boeing and Lockheed Martin. Richard Benveniste not only represents Boeing and United, but he also has other connections that destroy any credibility the investigation has left. In 2001, Daniel Hopsicker wrote a book called Barry and the Boys. It has an entire chapter entitled, Who is Richard Benveniste? Hopsicker says the lawyer Benveniste, quote, has made a career of defending political crooks, specializing in cases that involve drugs and politics. Benveniste represented Barry Seal, one of the most famous drug dealers in U.S. history, who also has alleged links to the CIA. He is referred to by some as a mob lawyer. In addition, Commissioner Lee Hamilton sits on several advisory boards, including those to the U.S. Army, the President's Homeland Security Advisory Council, and the CIA. Thomas Keane the Republican chair on the 9/11 Commission, cut a deal preventing Bush from testifying and allowing the White House to edit intelligence briefings before the commissioners could see them. Senator Max Cleland resigned over the commission's numerous conditions with the White House. In his own words, quote, "That decision compromised the mission of the 9/11 Commission, period."
You know, we should have had people, you know, on a panel that had no ties with our government officials. It is wrong. It is corrupt. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm telling you, anybody that sees this interview, they better open their eyes, because this is real. This is the most painful thing I've ever experienced in my life.
Republican Max Cleland was quoted in the United Press International as saying, quote, "The administration sold the connection between Iraq and Al-Qaeda to scare the pants off the American people and justify the war. There is no connection, and that's been confirmed by some of bin Laden's terrorist followers. What you've seen here is the manipulation of intelligence for political ends." Families of the WTC victims say the 9/11 Commission and Mayor Giuliani failed them. They proposed over 100 questions concerning the loss of their loved ones in the 9/11 attacks, but only 20% were answered. Several relatives of victims were disgusted that Giuliani was praised rather than questioned for only 5 minutes, and the 10 commission members failed to bring up any crucial issues.
It was disgusting. I'm glad you brought it up. They had spotlights on us. Every aisle, the spotlights connected to like 2 aisles, and they had guards, women and men in uniform with their hands crossed, just daring us to bust open with any kind of dismay or hurt or anything. They were just looking at us and daring us. And one woman got sick of it on the other aisle, and she put up liar, 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 and they took her out. You know, what is this? This is America. And if these churches and these public places you're going don't think it's real, it is real.
Let's ask some real questions. Is that unfair? And what about the bunker? You didn't ask them about the bunker, the Office of Emergency Management bunker on fire?
We are getting ready for the next panel.
Remember this. Your government funded and trained Al-Qaeda.
It is overdue for a second investigation. Yes, I do believe it. And I do believe that no one connected with the White House should be allowed on this panel.
In a conflict of interest are the chairman of the Joint Inquiry on 9/11, Senator Bob Graham, and Representative Porter Goss. In August of 2001, just weeks before the attacks, Bob Graham, Porter Goss, and Senator John Kyle were on a top-level mission in Islamabad, where meetings were held with President Pervez Musharraf and the head of Pakistan's ISI, General Mahmoud Ahmed. The general ordered a large money transfer of $100,000 to the presumed 9/11 ringleader, Mohammed Atta. And on the morning of September 11th, according to the Washington Post, Porter Goss and Bob Graham were having breakfast with Mahmoud Ahmed, the money man behind hijacker Mohammed Atta. FBI Counterterrorism Division Deputy Assistant John S. Pistoli testified before a congressional committee that the 9/11 investigation, quote, traced the origin of the funding of 9/11 back to financial accounts in Pakistan. Times of India reported that Saeed Sheikh and ISI Director General Mahmoud Ahmed were behind the funding of the 9/11 attacks. Also, it was reported that George Tenet, Director of the CIA, and Mark Grossman, the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, met with Ahmed at his top-secret meetings just days before September 11th. What were their intentions in conducting secret meetings and follow-ups with somebody notoriously close to Osama bin Laden and the Taliban in the week of and prior to September 11th? Put options set to expire on September 30th, 2001, were bought on August 6, 2001, or earlier, at the Chicago Board Options Exchange.
These put options were basically a bet that the stock would plummet. When it did, the people who purchased those put options made a lot of money.
Thousands of put stock options were bought on United and American Airlines immediately prior to September 11th, 2001. On average, during the first weeks of September 2001, 27 put options were bought each day on Morgan Stanley, one of the World Trade Center's largest occupants. The total of its put options for the 3 days prior to the attacks was 2,157. Merrill Lynch, also in the WTC, saw 12,215 put stock options. That is 12 times its normal level. Between September 6th and 7th, Chicago Board Options Exchange saw 4,744 put option contracts with United Airlines and only 396 call options. On September 10th, put options for American Airlines totaled 4,516 versus 748 call options. In addition, these trades were not only occurring in our country, but around the world. There is no chance that all or even most of the trades were placed by Osama bin Laden or Al-Qaeda. According to Fox News, CNN, and the BBC, insider trading reports were found in the USA, Germany, Britain, France, Canada, Japan, Monte Carlo, Switzerland, Hong Kong, Italy, Spain, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Singapore. The director of the CIA headed a firm that bought some of these put stock options. Until 1998, Buzzy Krongard headed United Airlines stock. Mr. Krongard was head of Bankers Trust until he resigned and was promoted to CIA Executive Director by President Bush in March 2001. Buzzy Krongard purchased this stock, and our government did nothing about it. The New York Times and the Wall Street Journal reported that Mayo Shattuck III resigned, for no given reason, as head of the Alex Brown unit of Deutsche Bank on September 14, 2001. Deutsche Bank is also one of the 4 banks most used by the bin Laden family. Additionally, $2.5 million in put options on United and American Airlines went unclaimed. The German central bank president, Ernst Weltek, had a study conducted by his bank. It indicated, quote, "There are ever clearer signs that there were activities on international financial markets that must have been carried out with the necessary expert knowledge in industries such as gold, oil, airlines, and insurance companies."
There was a lot of money to be made from the events of September 11th, and indeed, many people in our own government called the events of September 11th an opportunity.
I have gone to many attorneys that say their profession is with air crashes. No, they lie. They're only out for the end results, and it's money. They got me when I was grieving. They got you to sign things that they would be the power of attorney. Then I caught them in with Kenneth Feinberg, Special Master of the Victims Fund. If people don't know about what happened to these families, you notice they're not talking. It's because they started, the Red Cross started grieving groups as quick as they could. They got everybody crying together, laughing together, mostly crying. Then they brought in counselors because people couldn't sleep. We never had this in our country in this generation. And then they medicated them, and then they took them to the fund.
9/11 is a Christian issue. Why? Because we're lovers of truth. We're commanded to be the salt and light of the earth. Many Christians believe we're living in the last days, eschatology, the Bible calls it. And the signs are definitely there. Jesus said that no one knows the day or the hour, but that the time would come with many deceptions and much apostasy in the church. And the fact that Christians in America are so blind to what happened on 9/11. I just got done talking to a Christian who wanted to beat me up about telling them it's wrong for us supporting these military efforts as a result of 9/11. Asked him if he ever even read the 9/11 Commission report. He said, no, we're not looking at the things that are coming out of the White House. And the Bible says in 2 Thessalonians 2 that the coming of the lawless one would be with lying signs and wonders and with all unrighteous deception. Jesus said that we're to be awake and alert, that we're to be watchful. And I don't think we're doing that as a church. These things are happening around us in our country. Liberties are going away. And America has decided that its destiny is to be an empire.
The Bible says in Psalm 9:17 that the wicked shall be turned into hell, and all the nations that forget God. 9/11 was a warning of God's ultimate judgment upon America, because America has forgotten God. And the scriptures warn us. If we go to Isaiah 9, verses 8 through 10, this is symbolic. I don't know if I'd go so far as to call it a prophecy, but it is symbolic of where we are at as a nation as we have rejected God. It says, "The Lord sent a word against Jacob, and it has fallen on Israel. All the people will know, Ephraim and the inhabitant of Samaria, who say in pride and arrogance of their heart, the bricks have fallen down, but we will rebuild with hewn stones. The sycamores are cut down, but we will replace them with cedars." When the prophet Isaiah wrote this scripture, he was writing to the northern kingdom of Israel, who was in a state of apostasy. They had rejected God, and God allowed this terrorist attack to occur. They were attacked by the Assyrians, and the same happened with America. We are in a state of apostasy, and God allowed this terrorist attack on 9/11 to occur. So we see here in verse 9, all the people will know, Ephraim and the inhabitant of Samaria, who say in pride and arrogance of their heart. Basically, the leaders are making a public statement here in Israel, and they're saying it in the pride and the arrogance of their heart. God sent his warning of his ultimate judgment, and they are staying proud. They're not humbling themselves. They're not going to repent. They're saying this in the pride and arrogance of their heart. Well, this is the case on September 11th. September 12th, 2001, the Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle made a floor statement to the United States. And its exact words were, "Nothing can replace the losses that have been suffered. I know that there is only the smallest measure of inspiration that can be taken from this devastation, but there is a passage in the Bible from Isaiah that I think speaks to all of us at times like this. The bricks have fallen down, but we will rebuild with dressed stone. The fig trees have been felled, but we will replace them with cedars." So we have here, just as it was in the northern kingdom of Israel, the leaders coming forward. In this case, it was Tom Daschle, and he is quoting this scripture. But he's taking it out of context. He thought that it was a scripture of inspiration for the country, when actually it is a scripture of condemnation, because it is the sign of a nation that has rejected God. It is a sign of a nation that is not going to return, that is not going to repent. The scripture goes on, who say in pride and arrogance of their heart, the bricks have fallen down, but we will rebuild with hewn stone. The sycamores are cut down, but we will replace them with cedar. So we see another sign here, the fallen bricks on 9/11. We had fallen bricks, the towers collapsed. It says we will rebuild with hewn stone. Well, now we are rebuilding the Freedom Tower in place of the Twin Towers, which is supposed to stand at 1776 feet tall to represent the birth of our nation. It is taller than the Twin Towers, and the first stone to build this Freedom Tower was the cut stone, or the hewn stone, and it was cut out of the bedrock of New York as a sign of rebuilding. It says the sycamores are cut down, but we will replace them with cedars. Well, there was a freak event on 9/11. One of the only buildings that was left standing at the World Trade Center was St. Paul's Chapel. There was a beam headed right for St. Paul's Chapel from the North Tower as it was exploding, and this beam was headed straight for it, but it was stopped by a sycamore tree. This sycamore tree was uprooted by this beam, and this sycamore tree actually saved St. Paul's Chapel. Well, we actually replaced that sycamore tree, just as the scripture says, with a cedar as another sign of rebuilding. We replaced this sycamore with a cedar. It was called the Tree of Hope, and we replaced that tree at St. Paul's Chapel. Another interesting sign here is that the ultimate destruction, the ultimate judgment came to Israel in the destruction of the temple where Israel was dedicated to God. Well, George Washington dedicated the United States at St. Paul's Chapel at Ground Zero. So we have several signs in this one scripture. We have the leaders coming forth and speaking in pride and arrogance of their heart about rebuilding. We have the fallen bricks. We have the hewn stone. We have the sycamore, and we have that tree being replaced by the cedar. We have the terrorist attack, and we have the dedication at Ground Zero in this case, and the temple in Israel.
In Daniel 7, Daniel had a dream. And the dream kind of coincides with a similar dream that Nebuchadnezzar had about 4 kingdoms that were going to raise up in the earth. One, according to scholars, was Babylon. Then came Persia. Then came Greece. And then came what people assumed was Rome. And so these eschatology people believe that we're going to see some revived Roman Empire in the last days that will help usher in the Antichrist. But Daniel said, the 4th beast was dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong. It had huge iron teeth. It was devouring, breaking in pieces, and trampling the residue with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that was before it, and it had 10 horns. And it talks about how this kingdom devours all the kingdoms of the earth. And I think Rome was the beginning of that kingdom, but that kingdom never ended. And that kingdom consisted of every empire that spread its will and political force through bloodshed that consumed all the kingdoms of the earth, including America. We as Christians need to determine how we're going to respond to a country that decides it wants to be an empire. Are we going to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ? Are we going to help be that 4th beast kingdom that consumes all the kingdoms of the earth? Are we going to help put the Antichrist in power by hiding our head in the sand, not preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ, allowing men that say they're Christians continue to lie to the American people, lie to the Congress, make torture codified into law, take away the rights of American citizens, build concentration camps, build secret CIA prisons, and kidnap people against international law from other countries and fly into them secret prisons with no oversight? Are we going to continue to let this happen? And all of these things happen on the basis of 9/11. So when people ask, what would the motive be for our government doing that? I would respond with, well, what's been the result? If America determined through think tanks like Project for a New American Century that they're going to be an empire, then 9/11 worked wonderfully for that plan.
Yeah, who required NIST scientists to sign a non-disclosure agreement? I'd like to know who required that of those guys. I would never do it. But who required that? And there's several other questions. Why can't they release the photos to us? These are and videos that NIST acquired. Something like 7,000 photographs from private individuals, many of them. Why can't they just release that as a taxpayer's expense? Let us look. If there's nothing to hide, why hide it? And the fact that they won't release it does smack of some kind of a cover-up, all right.
But this time they crossed the line, and it's worth running these risks and encountering these hassles, getting hate mail from people on these conservative alert mailing lists who are told that, I've compared Bush to Hitler and I'm still teaching at Wisconsin, and so they write me death threats and obscenities. And But I also get a whole lot of support. And even Fox viewers who just happen to see me by accident were 50-50 positive, which is amazing. People who caught me on Hannity and Combs just because they were watching Fox, half those emails that came to me from that were positive.
I do know, I don't believe, I know that 9/11 was an inside job. Professor Stephen Jones has found residue of thermate on the steel samples from the World Trade Center. We now know that it was taken down in a controlled demolition.
Back in the book segment tonight, there's a fringe element out there that believes the U.S. government orchestrated 9/11. That is, President Bush and the American military killed 3,000 people. One of those pushing this theory is Kevin Barrett, who actually taught at the University of Wisconsin this fall. He joins us now from Madison. You know, there's no sense in debating this issue. I had one of your compadres on a couple of months ago. I don't believe a word you say. You're not going to change your position. My best argument is there's so much anti-American press out there. If you had a shred of legitimate evidence, it'd be on the front page of Le Monde or some other place that wants the USA to be embarrassed. So we don't see these reports anywhere. I don't believe you have anything. But you go on and you continue to say the Bush administration, American military, killed 3,000 people. How has that impacted your life? What has happened to you since you started doing this?
Well, you know, Bill, it's actually been one of the best things that ever happened to me. And in fact, we're not a fringe element. The latest polls show that 84% of the American people do not accept the 9/11 Commission report. Only 16% of the American people believe the government is telling the truth about 9/11. What poll is that? That's a New York Times poll that came out just several months ago.
I don't have that poll in front of me.
So actually, you're in the fringe element, Bill.
Yeah, I don't believe that that's true, but go ahead. What has happened?
Well, why don't you look it up? You can Google it up in 5 seconds.
Absolutely, we'll check it out. What has happened to you since you've been putting this outlandish stuff out there?
Well, it's not outlandish. In fact, as I said, it's now practically a majority position in the U.S. and certainly around the world. And I found that the people who are working in the 9/11 truth movement are some of the best, most honest, intelligent, caring, compassionate, and idealistic people that I've ever met in my life.
Then why won't any responsible news organization print this stuff?
Well, they do. They only print it once, though. For instance, all the newspapers.
It seems to be a big story at the President of the United States.
After 9/11.
Hold it.
BBC News printed stories about these hijackers turning up alive after 9/11. Other respected news outlets printed stories about how bin Laden met with the CIA when he was in Dubai in July 2001.
Okay.
Le Monde stands behind that.
If this story, if there was any evidence of this story, it would be all over the place. It would be the story of the century. It's no place.
Well, unfortunately, they print it once and then they just forget about it.
Why?
But the Guardian,
why would you forget about President Bush killing 3,000 Americans? Why would anybody forget about that? Why?
Well, maybe because he's killed 600,000 Iraqis and thousands more Americans. We all know he's a mass murderer, Bill, so why are we arguing about 3,000 people when he's already killed more than half a million people?
Now, you're not teaching anymore.
According to Johns Hopkins University, 600,000 Americans have been killed in Iraq. So what do we, 3,000 more, that's really not a whole lot.
600,000 Americans have been killed in Iraq?
That's right.
According to 600,000 Americans have been killed in Iraq.
600,000 Iraqis.
That's not what you said.
600,000 Iraqis and several.
Are you teaching anymore at the University of Wisconsin?
No, I'm not teaching right now.
Why?
I finished my semester. We had a great semester.
Why aren't you teaching anymore?
Because my semester ended. I'm on a semester-by-semester contract. I do intend to be back in the fall.
I don't think they're going to take you back.
My class was such a success.
They told us that you're not going to take you back.
They're very likely to be willing to take me back.
They told us they're not taking you back.
Well,
you know why they're not taking you back? Because you're irresponsible. You can't back up what you say. You're a propagandist.
But Professor Barrett isn't alone in his beliefs. One of his supporters joins us now. Dr. Bob Bowman is a member of Scholars for 9/11 Truth, currently a Florida Democratic congressional candidate. All right, so you believe this is an inside job? Do you believe this is a controlled demolition as he does? Do you believe that, Madrid and Bali and Zarqawi carried out by military intelligence? You believe these conspiracy theories?
No. I believe that the truth about 9/11 is that we don't know the truth about 9/11, and we should. I'm agnostic about these conspiracy theories. I think Professor Barrett has every reason to say his and expound his theories, just as you do yours.
There's a big difference between watching a television show or listening to a radio show, and the question here is whether or not he's the right man for the job. You know what? It wasn't an inside job. We can see the planes. The planes hit the building. It wasn't a controlled demolition, and the buildings came down. And it just is beyond bizarre that he believes it, but he's entitled to. but he's not entitled, he doesn't have a right to teach our students in the classroom. That's not a right.
Well, he has every right, because his conspiracy theory is far more believable than yours. The
no conspiracy theory.
FBI has admitted they have absolutely no evidence against these guys, Osama bin Laden.
The planes, we have video, actually hit the building. When a big plane hits the building, the building's going to come tumbling down. Do you think George Bush did it? Do you think Israel did it? I've heard so many sick, twisted conspiracy theories. What's, you know, where are you leaning towards? I don't know who did it, and neither do you, and we need the American people to get the truth. We have a right to know who did it, and so do the families of the victims. You know what? You can believe whatever you want. I don't really care. And this teacher can believe whatever he wants. I don't really care. I think you're both a little nutty.
You're a propagandist.
I think you're both a little nutty.
You're a propagandist.
Little nutty.
Propagandist.
Little nutty.
Propagandist.
We've had an uphill battle when it's come to going up against corporate media, and we've done tremendous work. And you know, more people are aware of 9/11 truth now than ever before, and more are becoming aware every day. I mean, there is a venerable army of people out there doing what we do every day, devoted our lives to exposing the fraud of September 11th.
Research it. More people are waking up every single day. More people realize what the stakes are.
Well, the solution is awareness, first of all. I think everybody needs to take that first step and understand that the official story is false. I also support an international investigation into the events of 9/11.
We've got hard physical evidence here. Let's open our minds up and request an investigation.
I want the truth. I want justice. I want those that's accountable to be punished. And I will not stop. And I'm asking anybody that sees or hears me that I'm not out for trouble. I am out for justice. This is not a conspiracy. This has been lies told to us, and most have taken the fund and gone away. Before they took the fund, they had to sign. They will never sue the government. They will never sue the airlines. They're medicated. Isn't that against the law?
I don't fear speaking the truth. So, you know, I know a lot of people are afraid. They worry, well, you're gonna you know, approached by the IRS or the FBI or the NSA or something. You know, I'm afraid of things like other people, but, you know, I'm more afraid of the truth not coming out at this point.
They must listen to wherever you show this interview. This is real. This is not something to say, well, it's 5 years ago. It could happen again. We cannot have that.
And I say to you, do you think those that died in the Twin Towers were worse sinners than you? I tell you, no. And unless you repent, you will likewise perish.
It's corruption all the way around. And we need to wake up, church, and realize that 9/11 is a Christian issue, and that we should not be caught sleeping and beating the servants of Christ when he returns, lest we be found thrown into the outer of darkness with weeping and gnashing of teeth.
I don't know who is responsible for 9/11, but I know that God is just, and that God allowed it to happen, and that God saw it, and they will be punished.
To America, 9/11 was a warning. There were pastors that came out afterwards and told America, we need to repent. And Christians are helping build this empire. Whatever you sow, you're going to reap. And as we continue to dominate other countries, as we continue to consume a majority of the world's goods and favor the rich over the poor, God will not favor us.
Each and every one of us has broken God's holy law. We have transgressed against a holy God, and God is just. And he would not be just if he let us all go free. But God is also a loving God, and he is also a God of grace and a God of mercy. And in that grace and mercy, God became a man. He became Jesus Christ, and he died for our sins. We can say in pride and arrogance of our heart, I'm going to be my own God. I'm going to do this on my own. I don't need God. And we're going to pay the price. Or we can look to Jesus Christ, who is the visible image of the invisible God. And God forgives us. God is love.
And there will be a time when Satan will reign in the flesh as the Antichrist, and those who do not believe will receive the mark. And then it'll be too late.
This is truth. If you are truly seeking the truth, you will hear his voice, and the Spirit will bear witness with your spirit that you are a child of God. Unless you repent, you will perish.
Against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist.
My message to America this morning then is this: fear the United States, for you will lose your liberty.
And then a fire marshal came in and said we had to leave because if there was a third explosion, this building might not last.
Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories concerning the attacks of September the 11th. Malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves, away from the guilty.
Never even got that close to the building. The explosion blew and it knocked everybody over.
The FBI is here, as you can see. They had roped this area off. They were taking photographs and securing this area just prior to that huge explosion that we all heard and felt.
George Bush fiddled while the Pentagon got hit by a missile. Blow a whistle. September 11th is just wrapped in a riddle, in a tunnel of darkness. Twin towers that stood went through a funnel of garbage, spark a flame to shed some light on who's to blame. Leading the blind the Illuminati's way. Shame on their eyes that see us stand to gain. See it's plain and simple, these planes crippled us for a reason. Call it terrorism, I call it treason. Call 9/11 while our country's still breathing. Screaming, dizzy from the media's spin. The holes in their stories leave me disbelieving the commission's whole story and the politicians passing legislation and acts of patriotism, overlooking evidence like the trial of O.J. Simpson. Brimstone and fire, the gloves of perfect fit on the hands of the ventriloquists, the 9/11 puppets. Project for New American Century calls for Pearl Harbor sequence of relentless events, and we're the audience in these theater wars that were written as document. It's written for Cheney, Rumsfeld, and Wolfowitz to increase spending in the Department of Defense. Is it a pretext or just a coincidence? Use your common sense. Bin Laden's had our assistance from the CIA ever since 1978. For instance, the $6 billion we spent in killing civilians of innocence in the city of Kabul under Bin Laden's intelligence at an American hospital. Osama saw CIA agents. Central Intelligence Agency is dealing with the enemy after he had supposedly bombed the American embassy. Oxymoronic hypocrisy and homeland security. Liberty for security. Liberty for security. Liberty for security. Liberty for security. This wouldn't be the first time Bush is trading with the enemy. I pray Prescott's sons don't fund another Nazi Germany by funneling money to the rising young fascists who kiss Satan's lips, tempting God's fist, attempting human evolution, but evolution doesn't exist. Adolf Hitler killed the Jews before they knew they'd been tricked, stripped and gassed like the Patriot Patriot Act implements. Soon we'll have nothing but crystallized cement. From WTC-7, the building that wasn't hit. Neither was the Pentagon. The lawn is perfect. Controlled demolitions. The plan is permanent. Can't circumvent the public outside this inside job. It's important to know they were warned and we were not. Like Mayor Willie Brown and General Ashcroft. United American Airlines put stock options bought. A brand new America and a new train of thought. Silverstein made a killing but didn't get caught. Faster than terminal velocity, World Trade Center got brought down. Payment on the war on terrorism. Now, payouts larger than ever in defense spending. How were we ever convinced it could have been prevented? Now we're the terrorists in a war that's never ending. Widowing wives and killing children, nobody's winning. Just sending lives in indefinite detention. We need more litigation like Ellen Mariani before more evidence is shipped off by Rudy Giuliani. And no investigation from the Bush administration. Quit wasting time and prepare for awakening. The taking is the truth. The truth will set you free. Break preconceived beliefs and save our liberty.